name is DJ Ralston. As Amy just shared, I work for George Washington University, and I work for a couple of technical assistance centers that are funded from the U.S. Department of Education to support state vocational rehabilitation agencies, which in Illinois would be DRS, or Department of Rehabilitative Services. So I'm going to share with you today a very abridged version of a two-part series that the Center for Innovative Training put on, which was specifically developed actually for state vocational rehabilitation agencies and community rehab providers around educating them as it relates to LGBTQ plus identity. And we talk about this in the context of disability, since state VR agencies are tasked with serving people with disabilities. So this presentation, just to kind of give you a heads up, is it's kind of the 101 basics. So some of this may be beyond you, but if that's the case, feel free to weigh in. We're going to go through quite a bit of information in a very short amount of time. There are not a lot of us in the session, which I'm actually kind of grateful for. And even though I have a tie on, I swear I'm not that formal. So because there aren't a lot of us, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and feel free. Or if that still feels intimidating, that's okay. Feel free to put it in the chat, or you can even DM it in the chat if you're not like super comfortable in terms of asking in front of others. Really, this is meant to help you all out. So please, 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 if you have questions or you want to weigh in, I would certainly encourage you to. So this is just our basic funding statement. You know, the feds make us put this on everything. So we'll skip that. So yeah, I said a little bit about this earlier, but I'm queer and non-binary, genderqueer. I'm also, I'm in the neurodiverse squad. So I'm a senior research associate at GW. I work on those 3 funded RSA centers. I'm also a doc student, you know, because as if I don't have enough to do. And my areas of interest and expertise include the intersection of disability and poverty, which I talked a little bit about that in the last round. Work incentives counseling, which is for those folks that might be in receipt of Social Security benefits, as well as financial empowerment, partnership development, braiding and blending resources, and in particular, working with the LGBTQ plus or LGBTQIA populations. Hope is by the end of this, you'll have some increased knowledge and the ability to utilize common language, how to support LGBTQ plus people, including transgender and gender expansive persons in their pursuit of work, and creating some strategies for creating a welcome environment, including kind of looking at your own situation. So I tend to be a lover of all things memes and GIFs. As you saw, I had Scooter in a GIF a little bit earlier, breathing into a paper bag. So that's typically how I feel when I'm presenting. But today we have Ina Garten with us, and she says, if you can't make your own estrogen, store-bought is fine. So for anybody who's ever watched the cooking channel or Food Network and has seen Ina Garten like talk about and do her cooking, she always like has these elaborate things, but will say like, oh, but if you can't do this, if you can't make this homemade, store-bought is fine. So that's kind of the reference, the joke there. So let's talk a little bit about the importance of language, right? So the importance of language, language really, it contributes to identity. And, you know, I think that our panelists in the last round really kind of outlined this for us, but it contributes to identity and it supports, it helps people find community, specifically when we start thinking about, you know, LGBTQ folks. So here's the next thing I'm going to say, and this is where I also want to extend an invitation if there happens to be anybody in the room who identifies as LGBTQIA or plus any one of those, feel free to weigh in, because here's what we can tell you is that LGBTQ folks, we're not a monolith, right? If you've met one non-binary person, you've met one non-binary person. If you've met one trans woman, you've met one trans woman. If you've met one, you know, lesbian, you've met one lesbian. So we're not a monolith, which means that there's a lot of difference, right? There's a lot of diversity of perspective. And quite frankly, there's a lot of nuance within the community. And occasionally there even is some discord in the community because there are some differences in some of the beliefs. So that's just something to keep in mind. Today, you're going to kind of get this from like my opinion, my lived experience, backed up by, you know, some research or resources that are pretty, you know, mainstream. The other thing to think about this is the language is evolving, right? There's this constantly changing landscape. It's not that we didn't have trans people 10 years ago, because we did, or 15 years ago, or 50 years ago. We did. It's not that we didn't have non-binary people, 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's that we didn't necessarily have the language, right? Because language continues to evolve. And so in this sense, it is constantly changing. Like I joked, like last week, I had like a 15-year-old tell me that they were polysexual. And I was like, what? That's a word I don't know. What is this? I had to go look it up, right? Like, and that's because it continues to evolve, right? Like we have pansexual, we have bisexual. Well, polysexual was the next one that I was like, so because it's changing, and it often changes quickly, it's just something that we need to be aware of. The other thing I want to talk about is a little bit about person first language versus identity first language. So when, and just at the end of the last session, we started to touch on ableism, right? And the stigma that disability tends to carry with it. Well, and as a result of that, most of us that come from the disability field have been raised in a way within our education and our experience that we're always supposed to use person first language. But the reality is there's a lot of folks out there right now, and there's a whole movement amongst the disabled activist community that specifically identifies as disabled and does not want to be a person with a disability. They want to be referred to as disabled. And part of that, that's that reclamation of that term, right? That's the stripping of its power, that connotation of, or stripping that word of what is considered bad. So one of the things that we really talk about in part of creating that welcoming space is utilizing language that clients use in talking about their multiple identities. So really what's informing your language, hopefully it's the way that your clients are talking about themselves. So real quick, just the basic definitions of LGBTQ+ or LGBTQIA, lesbian, a woman who's emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to other women. Gay, a person who's emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to members of the same gender. Bisexual is a person who's emotionally, romantically, or sexually attracted to more than one sex, gender, or gender identity, though not necessarily simultaneously, or in the same way, or to the same degree. Transgender is actually an umbrella term for people whose gender identity or expression is different from cultural expectations based on the sex that they were assigned at birth. Being transgender does not imply any specific sexual orientation. That's a really important one. Therefore, transgender people may identify as straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, the list goes on. Queer, also an umbrella term, also one of those words that's been reclaimed, right? I know a lot of folks who maybe have a little bit more experience under their belts, and in some of those generations might say, that was a really bad word. It was considered, harmful. It's in many ways been reclaimed. Now, there's also still a segment of the population from the LGBTQ population that would say that it's not a good word and don't use it or claim it, and still kind of, are taken aback by it. So again, really important nuance, language evolves. We just need to be mindful of how our clients are referring to themselves. Intersex is an umbrella term used to describe a wide range of natural bodily variations. In some cases, these traits are visible at birth. In other instances, they don't actually make themselves apparent till puberty, if they make themselves physically apparent at all. And this is actually one of the things where I'm like, yeah, when people think it's just XX or XY, it's not actually that simple. And the fact that we have people who are born intersex is proof of that. Asexual folks are those that lack sexual attraction or desire to other people. There's a lot more nuance to that definition, but I'm not going to get into that so much right now. So what you need to know for these ones is they did actually come from, I think the Human Rights Campaign is where those definitions came from. Real quick, let's talk about the difference between gender and sexual orientation. For those of you who this might be new to you, or this might be new to your staff, these are the types of conversations and things that you probably want to take back and have with your staff. But because LGBTQIA and because sexual orientation and gender identity get lumped under the big label, people often think about them as the same thing, when in reality, they're really different. Because your gender identity, your gender identity is your most inner sense of who you are. So it's like the part that lives in your brain. So when you notice, when we look at the gender unicorn here, this little rainbow that's up by the unicorn's brain, like that's gender identity. That's somebody's inner sense of whether they're male, female, boy, girl, other genders, either somewhere in between or completely outside that binary, or maybe a gender that flows back and forth or is fluid, okay? So that's gender identity, somebody's innermost sense of their own gender. Gender expression, as represented by these green dots, is essentially how people express themselves. So for me personally, like I tend to present myself very masculine. You know, I know folks that will present masculine, feminine. I know folks, you know, we know folks that will present androgynously. Sometimes there's expectations of people that are non-binary that they would present themselves as androgynous. But really, gender expression is how somebody chooses to express their gender in their clothing, hairstyles, you know, habits, mannerisms, etc. Sex assigned at birth is either female, male, intersex, or other. And that's basically when someone is born, it's what the doctor yells out, right? So that's sex assigned at birth. And that's how we talk about that, right? We don't say biologically male or biologically female. We say the sex someone was assigned at birth, all right? And then we talk about physical attraction and emotional attraction. So somebody, and this is often referred to as like sexual and affectual attraction in the counseling field. So if you're from the counseling field, you recognize that. If not, really what we're talking about is who people are physically attracted to, who people are emotionally attracted to, which can be, again, any range of genders, can be men, women, other genders as defined. So just real quick, we just wanted to lump these terms together. I'm not going to actually go back through them because I have a couple other slides that will really get into the gender identity ones. But what I really want to say to make this point right between gender identity and sexual orientation is sexual orientation is who you want to go to bed with. Gender identity is who you go to bed as, right? So that's a really good way to try and separate that. So your gender identity is about who you go to bed as. Your orientation is related to who you'd like to go to bed with, typically. So we did want to, the American Psychological Association, or APA, defines transgender terms, and we wanted to define those for folks because these often are things that get thrown around, but maybe not super defined, especially when we start talking about the fact that there are some of them that you're like, how are these any different? And I'm going to look at you and go, they're not all that different, but it really is up to folks to define how they use them. So cisgender, for folks who are not not aware of that, cisgender is used to describe individual whose gender identity and gender expression aligns with the sex they were assigned at birth. So if when you were born, the doctor said it's a girl and you're now an adult and you identify as a woman, then you are someone said to be cisgender. You will often hear folks refer to people as cis, which is just CIS, the shortened version of cisgender. So, or cishet, which is the shortened version of cisgender and heterosexual. So cishet being basically the dominant, the dominant norm. So yeah. So gender binary, the classification of gender into two discrete categories, male and female. So that is what those of us that are gender expansive or non-binary or gender non-conforming often rail against. I know I like to rail against it. But yeah, so the world is basically designed around the gender binary at this point, and there's some of us that would like to burn that down. I might be one of those people. So gender dysphoria is the discomfort or distress related to the incongruence between an individual's gender identity and their gender assigned at birth. So it can be really uncomfortable for someone, let's say, who was assigned female at birth, but identifies as male. That can oftentimes, that means that there's things that can happen. Oftentimes puberty is one of the catalysts for gender dysphoria, where you just feel it's a distressful situation where you feel really out of sync. And it is actually something that is diagnosable within the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and actually replaces gender identity disorder, because one's gender identity is not a disorder, but gender dysphoria is a real thing and can actually have additional emergent conditions such as anxiety, depression, social anxiety that can result when you have untreated gender dysphoria. Gender expression, again, we talked about that on the last slide. How one expresses themselves, clothing, physical appearance, external presentations, behaviors, etc. Gender identity, also talked about that on the last slide. That's the internal sense of being male, female, something else, or something else, which may not correspond to an individual's sex assigned at birth or sex characteristics, as well as may not correspond to that binary at all. Gender nonconforming is a catch-all, which describes an individual whose gender identity or gender expression differs from gender norms associated with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So for me, I will consider myself GNC or gender nonconforming, which is another way that we can hear about it. Gender expansive would be another example of gender nonconforming, another way to say that, right? Gender queer typically describes an individual whose gender identity doesn't align with the binary understanding, including those who think of themselves as both male or female, neither, moving between genders, or a third gender outside of gender altogether. For me, myself, I do like the term gender queer and I will often use it, but, and for me, I kind of look at gender queer as almost interchangeable with non-binary, but that's me. That's how I see it. Again, like a lot of nuance, and you're going to have different folks refer to them, like think about these words differently. So you really do want to key in and listen for how folks refer to themselves or identify themselves. Non-binary, a person who does not identify exclusively as man or woman. Non-binary people may identify as being both man and woman, somewhere in between, or as falling completely outside the categories. While many non-binary people also identify as transgender, so like as a trans non-binary person, not all people do. And so now you'll sometimes hear folks describe themselves as a trans non-binary femme or as a trans non-binary masc person, referring to whether they tend to lean masculine or tend to lean feminine. So again, a lot of nuance. People are going to kind of come across that the way that they do, and we really want to listen to our clients and the people that we're working with for how they're self-identifying. Trans affirmative, that's why you're here, because you want to be trans affirmative, hopefully. That's being aware of, respectful, and supportive of the needs of transgender and gender nonconforming individuals. One way to be trans affirmative in your organization is to have a training like this for folks that don't know this information. That's at least the start to something, that's the start to being trans affirmative. Again, transgender as an umbrella term, which we talked a little bit about already. Finally, trans man is someone who's transgender and identifies as a man. A trans woman is someone who is transgender and identifies as a woman. Someone who's trans and non-binary, someone who's transgender and identifies as non-binary. I'm finding some typos, sorry folks. Pansexual describes someone who has the potential for emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to people of any gender, though not necessarily simultaneously in the same way or to the same degree. Someone who is out is someone who's living openly in terms of their sexual orientation and or gender identity, where and when it feels appropriate to them. And outing someone is exposing someone's LGBTQ identity without their permission. This can have serious repercussions on employment, economic stability, personal safety, or religious family situations. Just a couple of quick notes about outing and being out before I get into pronouns. And one, if you are an agency that works with youth in any way, if a youth discloses to you that they are transgender or that they are non-binary, the first thing that you should say is thank you for trusting me and sharing that with me. And the second thing you should say is, are you out? Who knows? And that's because there are serious repercussions for folks, for young folks in particular, who are financially dependent on their families, because there are families that will not accept them. And in fact, I think it's something like 40% of the youth in foster care identify as LGBTQIA. So that's just something to keep in mind. That's a really important piece of this. The other thing that I would say about this is we also will sometimes run into transgender people who are not out. Yes, Mark, exactly. High rates of family rejection for LGBTQ plus youth, especially when we start talking about youth who are identifying as, or youth who are either identify as non-binary or transgender. And actually there's another statistic out there, and I should have pulled these for you, I apologize, but in addition to 40% of the foster care population identifying as LGBTQ youth, that population, LGBTQ youth in foster care, tend to end up more often in group homes than they do in private foster care homes. And that in large part is attributed to the number of folks who have strong religious convictions that they don't want LGBTQ youth in their homes, which means that there's that double rejection factor, right? Like, so you've got an LGBTQ youth that is then isolated and rejected from their family, and then potentially rejected from a foster home for the same reason. So when I talked about trauma this morning or earlier today, this is one of the things I'm talking about. And yeah, so the other thing is oftentimes, not oftentimes, but we do occasionally have folks as well who might be transgender, who may be assumed to be cisgender, all right? And in that case, if they're not out, that can sometimes be referred to as folks being stealth. So it really is important when someone discloses their identity that you ask those questions relative to how they want to be addressed. Are they out? How would they like to be addressed? So just some important things to think about. Yes, and the homeless and yes, a 100% Mark. The homeless and unstably housed youth populations reflect shocking percentages. There's a really great study out there, and I'll have to go find it, that Minnesota did a really good study that was looking explicitly at homeless youth, and yeah, and tracking some of that data. There's some interesting stuff out there. So pronouns, there are many pronouns actually. So here we have some of the more common ones. So feminine, she, her, hers, masculine, he, him, his, gender neutral can include they, them, their, and then gender neutral can also include a range of neopronouns such as they, her, and hers. And then, examples of like, they went to the store, I spoke to them, it was their apple. They went to the store, I spoke to her, it was hers apple. So really, again, asking folks to identify what their pronouns are is one way to do it. We also talk about another way to kind of signal to folks is to introduce yourself and say your pronouns. Yeah, so for those people that do tend to, there is the occasional pushback, right, against the singular use of they, saying it's grammatically incorrect. But the most interesting man in the world here tells us that I don't always use they as a singular pronoun, but by God, when I do, I'm being gender inclusive. One of the things that we want to point out is singular use of the word they was Merriam-Webster Dictionary's 2019 word of the year. It's been accepted and is now in use by the Associated Press Style Book, which pretty much governs all media outlets. And then the Chicago Manual of Style, as well as the APA manual. So also the two major governing kind of academic entities also accept singular use of they. So this is just to demonstrate what it's like when somebody uses your pronouns correctly. I shared, actually, I came out at work during the facilitation of this webinar series. So I had been in my workplace for 5 years, and I came out at work, and when folks at work started using my pronouns, like this is pretty much how I felt all the time. So Spider-Man being really excited, kind of euphoric feeling. So we do want to talk real quickly about transition. So the American Psychological Association defines transition as the process of shifting toward a gender role different from the one assigned at birth. And this can include social transition, like things like new names. It can include new clothing, new pronouns. It can include hormone replacement therapy or surgeries. But we're going to talk about it kind of in 3 phases. And I'm going to use Chris Moser's Instagram to do it. So Chris Moser is a trans man who's a transgender pro athlete for Nike. He's been an All-American athlete, and he's also a 6-time member of Team USA and a professional speaker. He does a lot of advocacy work, both on Instagram, like on all social media platforms, but as well, and helps kind of organize and disseminate templates for calling legislators when there's anti-trans stuff. So just all around great advocate. And I thought he did a really great job talking about transition. So I'm like, why reinvent the wheel, right? When we can follow what Chris says. So what does it mean to transition? So Chris talks to us about it and says transition is really referring to a process a transgender individual takes to live consistently with their gender identity, and essentially breaks it down by 3 main categories: social, medical, and legal. And this is really, I think, helpful for organizations that are working with folks, because this is where we start to see implications for folks when it comes to where they are in if they are transitioning, where they are in a transition process. We can see that come up within the job prospect kind of area relative to applying for jobs, and what do we do about all those things. So the first thing that we need to know is that transition is actually a lifelong process, particularly if someone opts to take hormones. So when you hear someone that say potentially that, I transitioned X years ago, that's normally when they're talking about they started their process. Another really, really important thing, kind of like we talked about earlier, there's no one right way to transition, just like there's no one right way to be LGBTQ. And so people need to do what's best for them. And we want to make sure that, you know, that people have that space, because it is an extremely personal process and it's going to be different for each person. And the goals of somebody's transition are really up to them. I'm like looking at my time. Okay. So there's no blueprint, quite frankly. People can take any step in any order or take none of these steps and still be transgender or gender nonconforming if that's how they identify. So again, really, really important that we're respectful of how people identify and where they are in their own journeys and what that journey looks like for them, because there's no wrong identity for folks. So social transition can include changing one's name or pronouns, hairstyle, clothing, or other physical expression. It can include mannerisms or speech patterns, restrooms one uses, etc. So for me, I came out socially at work just about a little over a year ago at this point. But, you know, I've been out socially in my personal life for a long time. And, you know, in some ways, I guess we could say, well, I didn't come out at work until last year. I had started to, you know, shift my dress 5 or 6 years ago at work. So I've always worn a shirt and tie as long as everybody in my workplace has known me. I've always gone by my name, but, you know, I shifted my haircut too. I cut my hair a couple of years ago to help me feel more consistent in living my authentic self as my, you know, as my gender. So social transition can include those things as well as more. When we talk about medical transition, we're talking typically about the use of, potentially the use of hormone blockers, hormone therapy, gender affirming surgery, electrolysis or laser hair removal, or other gender affirming procedures. Here's the thing, it could be one of these things, it could be all of these things. Everybody's medical transition, if they opt to medically transition, is going to look different. Some folks are going to choose, maybe some folks just need the use of a hormone blocker and they choose not to necessarily use hormone replacement therapy. By the way, hormone blockers, completely 100%, like if you take them, that it doesn't actually change anything. It just stops like the current receipt of those hormones. So, and I say this really because there's a lot of arguments about whether young people should have access to gender affirming care, which typically mostly consists of the use of hormone blockers, and that helps pause puberty while the young person really kind of sorts through and figures everything out relative to their gender identity. And then once, if they were to determine, for example, that they felt like they were cisgender, then they would just stop taking those blockers and their, you know, puberty would proceed as typical development. So there's a lot of stuff around there that, you know, that gets thrown around that's inaccurate. So I think, you know, this is the point where I say also really important to make sure that you're checking sources when you're doing, when you're looking around some of this work. Legal transition. And this is the big one, I feel like, for those of us that are working directly with clients and helping them get jobs, because oftentimes we know that employment requires identification, it requires social security cards, birth certificates, bank accounts, credit cards, job-related documents, medical records, passports, and other documents. So depending on where somebody is in their legal transition, these things can actually come up as issues as we're working with folks. But legal transition typically includes the changing of one's name and or gender marker on their, like, within the legal scope, which again kind of includes all of these pieces. So not every trans person wants to medically transition. I said that earlier. Not doing so, again, does not make anyone any more so or less trans. And really, again, I'm going to hammer this. There's no right way to transition. There's only a right way for that person. And people have their own agency to determine what that is for them. So just real quick, until the summer of 2020, so literally just over a year ago, there were no protections for LGBTQ folks in the workplace, and they could be fired for their identity or their orientation. And actually, there's still some ministerial exceptions, which essentially means some of the faith-based employers can still fire someone for their identity or their orientation. But the passage of this law in the summer of 2020 was a big deal and is helpful. But I think one of the things that we heard this morning that we all know too is that even though these protections are here, discrimination and stigma still occur. So it is important for us to think about that, and also for us to make sure that we do some research relative to, you know, into how we can support folks who are being discriminated against or feel that they're being discriminated against. So creating a welcoming space. You want to, if you're an agency or organization, you want to consider your application and intake process. Are you asking folks if they have a preferred name or name that they go by, or are you inviting folks to share that information? Are you including your own pronouns when you introduce yourself? Again, that's a really easy way to signal to folks that you are inclusive and supportive. And asking about pronouns. This can be a little nuanced. Some folks are like, oh, you shouldn't ask people their pronouns because then you could force somebody who's not out to like give you pronouns, and maybe that's going to be painful. So I really think that as an agency or organization, you all have to have that discussion and decide where you want to land on that one. Some agencies do ask specifically about pronouns. Other agencies just choose to introduce themselves and follow that by using their own pronouns as a means to encourage people. You want to understand and use a language of the LGBTQ plus community. I mentioned that earlier today. That's an important piece of this. I assume that's why some of you are here. You want to also like have some context of the culture and the cultural references. I think that we didn't get really too much into this morning, but I do feel like the culture is really important. And the cultural references, like as you've seen me kind of drop in a bunch of memes today, including this one, because, you know, like if somebody calls me by my birth name, I won't even turn around. So yeah, accessibility is another key piece. And that accessibility is related to disability. So, you know, but beyond just the physical accessibility of the building, which is going to include, you know, do you have automatic door openers for somebody using a chair? Is there an elevator if you're in a building with stairs? Like, is there enough room in the hallways? Do you have bathrooms that are sufficient? All of those things, right? But in addition, you want to look at the accessibility of your programs and make sure that your programs are accessible and not necessarily screening people out. So when we talk about creating safety, like one of the things that I think that we all talk about in our field, right, is safe spaces. But the reality is we can't actually create a safe space, because the only person who can determine whether or not a space is safe or not is the person who's entering that space, right? So in other words, like I can like to think that my office is a safe space, but you know what, if the client comes in, they may not think that, and that's totally up to them. So that's an important kind of caveat to all of this, but all of these things we're talking about are ways that we can help encourage and create this. So you know, asking people what they actually need, right? Like, you know, one of the things is that gender identity and sexual orientation is often not the main or only concern. This is particularly true if somebody is coming maybe to another agency like DRS, but there is typically other concerns that a person has. So it's important for us to continue to think about folks holistically and understand that their challenges or issues that they may be having, or rather the resources or supports that they need, are not just around their orientation and their identity. There's going to be potentially other areas. Please use correct pronouns. We ask people to practice in front of a mirror, practice before you talk to someone. And then, you know, the other thing we're talking about is making sure that you're thinking about and centering people of color and their narratives, and recognizing, like we talked about this morning, that anytime you add an additional social identity that's been oppressed, we're looking at intersectionality that can create and reinforce additional trauma. So it's really important that we are mindful and cognizant of that. And then again, accessibility needs. What do your restrooms look like? You know, what, like, is that something that works out? Like, is your office accessible? Is there enough space for people to move in and out? Thinking about advocacy, I feel like most of you know this, but modeling correct gender pronouns and name, correcting people as needed. So if you have a colleague or coworker that maybe is misgendering someone, making sure that you point out, hey, you know what, that person uses they pronouns, or, you know, she, her pronouns. You want to provide resources. So one of the things we talk about for vocational rehabilitation agencies in particular is they don't have to be the experts on this, you know, like you don't have to be the experts, but you need to know where the experts are. So like in this case, like maybe it's that you need to get involved with and partner with Chicago House, right? Because they've got some of the trans works programs. So just something to keep in mind is how can you locate resources that can support folks for areas that you may not have all of that expertise, but that you do so in partnership, because this is not a drop and run, right? It's really important that we continue to maintain our relationships and that we figure out how to work together. You want to create as open and affirming spaces as possible. This can be done with flyers, stickers, again, through your intake forms, those types of pieces. All gender restrooms, providing staff training, something similar to this, like today, where we kind of cover all the basics. And you want to do your best to make it safe for people to tell their stories without judgment. So again, knowing who's in the audience right now, I know that you all know that. So also thinking about supporting folks who are gender expansive and transgender. This is really, you know, like, where is the person adult? Are they a minor? Are they, like, if they're a minor, does their guardian have to be there? What about government ID? What are Illinois' laws relative to that? Did they change from county to county? Like, you know, where I live in Ohio, and Ohio is ridiculous. Like, it's different from county to county, and, you know, the things that they make you jump, the hoops they make you jump through. But, you know, thinking about name and gender, if somebody is changing the marker on their birth certificate, is that possible in your state? If it is possible, what's needed? So does somebody have to have surgery and then provide proof of, you know, documentation of surgery in order to change that gender marker? What about name change fees? All of those things are things that folks want to think about. What are the, you know, anti-discrimination laws and policies? What does somebody do if they have been discriminated against? Like, what recourse do they have? So that's going to be really important. And the other thing is, like, we would encourage folks to potentially look at the other LGBTQ plus supporting agencies in their area and mirror how they're doing their work. When we talk about applying for jobs with a legal name, when someone has socially or medically transitioned but hasn't necessarily legally transitioned, you know, one of the things that we typically advise is there's two ways to go, and it's not our job to make the decision. It's just our job to help the person that we're working with make an informed decision. So, you know, resumes should always be somebody's, you know, name that they go by, regardless of whether or not they've legally changed it, because a resume is in no way legally binding. But, you know, the question comes up, what about when you're filling out a job application and there's a self-attestation statement at the bottom that says, I hereby certify that all this information is true. Well, the reality is somebody has two options. They can put their legal name, and when they do, they, you know, and the employer calls for an interview, they can say, yes, this is Bob, but I go by Sally. They've now outed themselves. They have likely outed themselves as transgender. And or they can not, they can use the name that they go by, and potentially, you know, hopefully there aren't any issues, but when they are hired and extended the job, you know, could that company come back and say, ooh, you lied on your application, so we have to fire you? Technically, yeah, because you made a sworn statement that all the information was true and didn't provide a true name. So again, not our jobs to figure out what is best for our clients to do. Our job is to make sure our clients know what their options are and help them make that informed choice, because we're not here to pass judgment. Again, looking at your agency or organization's language, that can include looking at intake forms, your case management systems, bathrooms. Please don't dead name people. Dead naming is when you use their legal name, even though they have another name they go by. I feel very much like SpongeBob. If somebody uses my legal name, I'm not here for it. I'm gonna, you know, rip things up. It's a quick way to damage our relationship. Locating, connecting to resources. We just tried to provide you all with some of the basics at the very high level. But again, you don't have to be an expert, because there are many, many folks who do this work and that are experts at it, but you should know how to find resources to support the folks that you're working with. And how to partner with those agencies to continue to support people. Also, if you can, community involvement. Find your local, you know, find a local chapter of PFLAG, or find the local HRC chapter, or, you know, any one of those things, and get involved to learn more about the community if you want to be a true ally. Final concepts and reminders. this is kind of actually ironic, right? It's trans people, Ron, not transgenders, which is Hermione telling Ron. And the reason that I say it's ironic is just because of where J.K. Rowling stands when it comes to trans people, but that's kind of all the more fun, I think, in using this meme in particular. So sex is biological, chromosomal, and it's also a construct. There are various sexual affectual orientations out there. Gender identity is often understood before sexual orientation, and gender identity encompasses an inner sense of being. Transsexual is an outdated term, so please don't use it, stick to transgender. So do a transgender person, a trans man, a trans woman, a non-binary person, genderqueer individual. Don't, as Hermione so aptly says, don't use transgenders or a-trans or transgendered. And that's because trans and transgender are actually adjectives, so they should not be treated like nouns. Also, please, please, please don't say, I would have never known you were trans or disabled, because in some ways that still is implying an other, right? Like it's still setting that person aside as if they're different. So don't do that. Finally, disability encompasses both invisible and visible disabilities, and disabled folks exist on that spectrum of sexual affectual gender spectrums as well. We have some resources, some quick links, again, more resources, some references.